Fellas, as of right now, the UFC is probably the most diverse it's ever been, with the amount of contenders and champions and just overall up-and-coming fighters from different countries, and the amount of different locations the UFC are going to. I thought it'd be the perfect time to rank the different countries in the UFC based on how successful the fighters from that country have been. So how many champions have they had? How many top contenders and prospects have they had? How successful has this country been as a whole? And I'm going to be ranking 16 different countries. Obviously, I can't rank every single country that a fighter has ever come from in the UFC, because there'd just be a ton of countries with like one fighter. So I'm going to be ranking the 16 main countries with significant fighters coming from that country. And yeah, let me know your thoughts and if I should have included any other countries. But we'll start on number 16th. At last place on this list, I've gone with South Africa. Yeah, South Africa has made number 16th last on this list. Now, they've got one champion from South Africa in Dricus du Plessis, and they've got a contender in Cameron Simon. But yeah, if it wasn't for Dricus du Plessis, they probably won't be on this list. But because of what Dricus du Plessis have done for South African MMA, the way that he's always repped South Africa, and his whole thing is that he's, you know, big in South Africa and he's a real African champion, I've got to include him on this list. And he's a good champion as well. Beating Whittaker, Strickland, Adesanya in a row is crazy. We also had a contender at one point in Cameron Simon, who we thought was going to be a big problem for the UFC, and then in his last fight got absolutely butchered by Peyton Talbot, so he's kind of like a hype train that got derailed. So they've got Cameron Simon, they've got Dricus du Plessis. Apart from that, South African MMA don't really have anything else going for them, but just because of Dricus du Plessis alone, I've got to include South Africa on this list, and I'll put them last place. If they had a couple of more prospects or maybe another ranked fighter, maybe they'd get higher on this list, but you can't really get any higher just from Dricus du Plessis alone. So for South Africa, I'm going to put them at number 16th. We haven't really seen any major talent come from South Africa, but I do expect some talent to come from South Africa in the next few years because of, like I said, what Dricus du Plessis is doing for MMA in South Africa. So at number 16th, last place on this list, I'm going to go with South Africa being the last country ranked on this list. And then just above South Africa, I'm going to go with Japan. Now, Japanese MMA has always been a big thing, but I feel like it's bigger outside of the UFC than in the UFC. But if we talk strictly in the UFC, there's yet to be there's yet to be a Japanese champion in the UFC, but there's a couple of contenders, and the standout fighter right now is Tatsuro Taira. He's a ranked flyweight, top 5 ranked flyweight. He's undefeated, and he actually seems to have good potential in the flyweight division, especially based on his last fight with Alex Perez. So he's a big prospect from Japan as well. We've also got Rei Suzuki, a guy who entered the UFC in his last fight, looked really good as well. So Rei Suzuki is a good name in Japanese MMA. And overall, even though there might not be a ton of, contenders and any champion from Japan, it seems to be growing massively, does MMA and the UFC in Japan. I mean, look at the road to the UFC. It's basically the contender series for countries like Japan and China and Korea and basically all the Asian countries. It's basically just a contender series for those areas. So the road to the UFC is definitely big, and we've amount of new Japanese, just the Japanese talent that we've had in the UFC in the past couple of years, especially, like I said, with the road to the UFC and the contender series is crazy. And I expect in the next couple of years, we to have so many more Japanese contenders, especially with like the crossovers that they're doing with other organizations, with big Japanese stars from other organizations coming over to the UFC. Japanese MMA seems to be growing. It seems to be getting bigger and bigger. We've got a couple more prospects that are entering the UFC now. So for Japan, even though they've never had a champion, I've got to put them at number 15th. Seems to be a lot of talent up and coming from Japan, and I've got to recognize that. I'd put it at 15th on this list, just above South Africa. And then just above Japan, and number 14th on this list, I'm going to go with Moldova. Now, there's not any crazy talent from Moldova. There's never been a champion from Moldova, and I think it's going to stay that way. But they've got a couple of contenders. I mean, the standout fighter from Moldova is Sergey Spivak. He's a top 10 ranked heavyweight fighter. He's been ranked for ages. He's fought a lot of good names. He's coming off a win, and he's a pretty good grappler in the heavyweight division. Sergey Spivak. He's nothing crazy. He's never going to become a champion, but I guess he's got to make the list. And also in the heavyweight division, we've got another ranked heavyweight from Moldova in Alexander Romanov. Kind of just as the blob of the heavyweight division, isn't anything crazy. We also have Ian Cutelaba, who's kind of just an NPC in the light heavyweight division. So yeah, they've got those three in Moldova. They've got 2 ranked fighters in Moldova, 2 guys who have fought a lot of the top contenders in the heavyweight division. And for that reason alone, I've got to include them on this list. Spivak and Romanov come from them, so I've got to recognise them. But apart from these guys, there isn't really anything else going for Moldova, so I can't really put them higher on this list. But to be fair, there's only been 4 fighters in the UFC, I believe, from Moldova. 3 of them have done pretty successful so far. 2 of them are ranked, so it seems like the talent that is in the UFC from Moldova has done quite well. So I'm going to have to put Moldova on this list. I'm going to have to rank them at number 14th on this list. The fighters that have come from Moldova have done pretty well, but again, apart from Sergey Spivak and Alexander Romanov, 2 guys who are never going to become a champion, it's nothing crazy. Just above Moldova, I'm going to go with Ireland. I'm going to go with Ireland at number 13th. Now, the main reason Ireland has actually made the list is obviously because of Conor McGregor. They've had one champion from Ireland, obviously being Conor McGregor, but obviously he was a champion in 2 weight classes, which I guess gives him more credit and obviously means a lot more than just being a champion in 1 weight class. So the standout fighter obviously is Conor McGregor, but it means a lot if your standout fighter is Conor McGregor. He's the biggest star in MMA as a whole. He's the first guy to hold 2 belts simultaneously, one of the biggest stars in the sport. His run in his prime was insane, and he's just a notable name, for, well, the most notable name in Irish MMA. The amount of guys that he's beaten before, his run up, how successful he was in his early UFC career. I've got to mention that, and like I said, the biggest star, and he's going to be basically just paving the way for Irish MMA as well. And they've also got Ian Gary, who I guess is an undefeated contender in the welterweight division. And the fact that he's managed to make himself a big name in the welterweight division, I've got to give him credit for. But the problem with Ireland, even though having Conor McGregor on there as representing their country is absolutely massive, and they've got Ian Gary, it's not like they've got some crazy talent outside of the two of them. Like, if you take away Ian Gary and Conor McGregor, what else do Ireland really have going for them? Like, we saw at UFC 304, a lot of Irish fighters competed, and a lot of them just looked terrible. So, outside of Ian Gary and Conor McGregor, they don't really have anything else going for them. But Conor McGregor himself definitely has to push Ireland high on this list because of what he's achieved. So, Ireland, I'm going to put Ireland at number 11th on this list. Number 13th on this list. Conor McGregor paved the way for Ireland. They've got Ian Gary. Apart from that, there's nothing crazy. They don't have any really major talent outside of Conor McGregor and Ian Gary. But number 12 on this list, I'm going to go with Nigeria. Now, Nigeria's a weird one because for the champions, they've got 1.5 champions. Israel Adesanya, even though he says he's from Nigeria, the amount of countries this guy is represented, he's represented New Zealand, he's represented China, he's represented multiple different countries, that I can't really put him down to just a pure Nigerian fighter when he doesn't really represent Nigeria. But to be fair to Nigeria, they've had Kamaru Usman, who in my opinion is the 2nd greatest welterweight of all time. One of the best title runs in modern UFC history. Almost were breaking records as well in the UFC, and Usman is one of the greats, definitely in the welterweight division. So having that from Nigeria is definitely big as well. They've also had quite a few contenders. Obviously, they had Sadiq Yusuf, who was once ranked and once a good name in the featherweight division, and to be fair, he still is. They've got Mohammed Usman, who's kind of like just a basic unranked heavyweight, nothing special. But if Adesanya was fully repping Nigeria and he wasn't repping all these other countries, I'd probably have to put Nigeria above on this list because they've got Adesanya, who's the 2nd greatest middleweight of all time. They've got Kamaru Usman, who's the 2nd greatest welterweight of all time. So those 2 names alone is definitely what's pushing Nigeria so high up on this list. But like I said, apart from those 2 guys, there's nothing crazy. And Adesanya, half the time, it doesn't even rep Nigeria. So for Africa, well, not in Africa, but for Nigeria as itself, I'm going to put Nigeria at number 12. Apart from Usman and Adesanya, there's nothing crazy going on. But what those guys have achieved definitely pushes them high on this list. At number 11th, I'm going to go with Canada. For the size that Canada is, they should have had many more like big names coming from Canada. They've had 2 champions in Carlos Newton and obviously GSP, and obviously the standout fighter to come from Canada is GSP. He paved the way for Canadian MMA. He's one of the greatest of all time. Some people would say he is the greatest of all time, and because they've got one of the greatest names in MMA history for coming from Canada, they've got to be high on this list, which is why they've made it this high. But yeah, GSP paved the way for Canadian MMA, and he's definitely the biggest name to come from Canada, and is probably the only notable name to come from Canada. I mean, Canada's had some other, I guess, notable names. They've had Rory McDonald, who has been involved in some bangers and was once a fun fighter to watch. They had the first Canadian champion in Carlos Newton, who I guess has to get the respect to make this list. But apart from that, Canada doesn't really have anything else going from them. They've just kind of got a lot of mid-fighters. I mean, if you look at the current state of Canadian MMA, a lot of these Canadian prospects and up-and-comers haven't been doing well recently. Charles Jourdain just got whooped by Gene Silva. Marc-Andre Barriault just got KO'd by Joe Pyfer. Mike Mallet just got finished by Neil Magny. So it's not like Canada's doing insane right now when it comes to the UFC and when it comes to MMA. So they've got 2 champions. They've had GSP, which is their biggest accomplishment. But apart from that, Canada don't really have anything else going for them, and a lot of the fighters that have come from Canada do tend to be kind of mid. So I'm going to put Canada at number 11th. For the size that Canada is and for the population of Canada, they should have produced so many more killers, but they just haven't. So they're going to have to make 11th on this list. At number 10, now we're in the top 10, I'm going to go with China. Now, similar to Japan, Chinese MMA has been growing massively in the past couple of years, and they've got one champion right now to come from China in Zhang Weili, and she seems to be one of the most dominant women MMA fighters right now. She seems pretty much unbeatable. She's so talented, and she is, one of the greatest, one of the best right now when it comes to women MMA. She's the Chinese champion. There's also got Yang Xiaonan, who actually fought Zhang Weili in some China-on-China violence at UFC 300. Another top contender to come from China. If they'd have done a UFC China, that would have been massive. They've also got Song Yudong, a powerful contender in the bantamweight division. Nothing crazy, but he's still a contender. He's still a top 10 ranked fighter in the bantamweight division. So they've got some good contenders from China, and it does seem like Chinese MMA in the past couple of years, with the additions of people like Yang Jianan and Zhang Weili, does seem to be massively growing. And I expect in the next couple of years, like I said, with things like Road to the UFC, that the UFC are going to get some massive talent from China. But yeah, I think they've got to make the top 10. They've had Zhang Weili. They've got a couple of unranked names. They've got Song Qin, and they've got obviously Li Jingliang as well. Song Yudong, Yang Xiaonan. The talent seems to be growing in China. They've got a Chinese champion who seems to be unstoppable right now. So for China, I'm going to put them at number 10 on this list for talent and just overall how successful they've been with the fighters that they've got. And like I said, if you look outside the UFC, there's many organizations that have a lot of successful Chinese fighters as well. So purely in the UFC, I'm going to put China at number 10. Can't really put them higher because they've not really got anything else going for them outside of the contenders that they've got and Yang Xiaonan and Zhang Weili. But I'll put them at number 10. And then at number 9, I'm going to go with France. Now, unless you're counting Cyril Gane's interim champion win, and I guess if you count, GSB being French-Canadian, they haven't actually had a single undisputed champion yet, but the reason they've made number 9 is because of how quickly French MMA has grown. You look previous to 2019, there wasn't really much French talent in MMA or in the UFC. But in these past couple of years, there's been so many big prospects and so many up-and-comers from France. Obviously, the standout fighter being Cyril Gane. He's fought John Jones. He's fought Francis Ngannou. He's a former interim heavyweight champion. He's still one of the best heavyweights in the world and still one of the top heavyweights, and I think he will be for a while. Just from Cyril Gane alone, France has got to go that high up in this list. They've got Fiora as well, who, in my opinion, should be fighting for a belt in the next fight. She's super talented. She beat Erin Blankfield. She's undefeated in the UFC. She has a bright future in the UFC. They've got Benoit Saint Denis, who's a ranked lightweight. Did get fraud checked by Dustin Poirier, but I still think he can build himself up if he's smart. He's got a main event up and coming with Renato Moicano in France as well. And they've got a couple of other prospects. They've got Kevin Doucet, a good prospect from France. They've got William Gomis as well. So France just seems to be thriving right now. It seems to be in the best place it's ever been. We have multiple UFC Parises each year, or at least one UFC Paris fight night every year, which seems to be doing well. There seems to be a lot of new talent coming from France every year in MMA. Like I said, last year we had Kevin Doucet, and obviously we got big names right now with guys like Cyril Gane and Benoit Saint Denis. So French MMA seems to be growing faster than ever. They've had an interim champion before in Cyril Gane, but apart from that, they haven't had any champions. But because of how quickly it's grown and because of how successful a lot of the fighters have been, I'm going to have to put France on this list, and I'm going to have to put them at number 9 on this list. They've been pretty successful, so France is going to go at number 9 in my opinion. At number 8, I'm going to go with Poland at number 8. Yeah, in my opinion, Poland's going to go at number 8. They've had 2 champions, and the 2 champions that they've had have been really successful. The standout fighter to come from Poland is Mr. Polish Power himself, Jan Blachowicz, the first guy to defeat Israel Adesanya in MMA, the former light heavyweight champion of the world, and still to this day, one of the top light heavyweights in the world. Gave Alex Pereira his toughest test, and himself has, been massive for Polish MMA. And they've got Joanna Jędrzejczyk, one of the greatest women MMA fighters of all time, former champion, and like I said, her run that she went on in her prime was absolutely insane. One of the most dangerous female fighters of all time. And they've got a couple of contenders. They've got Matthias Gamrot, who's had some good wins in the lightweight division, and he's ranked in the top 10. They've got Marcin Tybura, a top 10 ranked heavyweight right now. So they've got a couple of good fighters coming from Poland. The 2 champions that they've had definitely puts them this high on this list. Like I said, they've had 2 champions. One of them was one of the greatest women MMA fighters of all time. The other one was Jan Blachowicz, who's still thriving to this day. They've got 2 other ranked fighters in, obviously Matthias Gamrot and Marcin Tybura. There's a couple of Polish talent, Polish prospects up and coming in the UFC as well that I've got to give credit to. So Poland, they seem to be doing pretty well. Nothing absolutely crazy. I can't really say they're one of the best countries when it comes to MMA right now, but for the fighters that they've got and the fighters that they've had, they've accomplished quite a lot. So Poland, I'm going to have to give them that number 8 spot on this list. They've accomplished quite a lot, and because of the champions that they've had, they've done pretty well so far. At number 7th, I'm going to go with Georgia for 7th. Now, Georgia, I'm going to say they've got half a champion because they've got Ilia Topuria, right? Georgia's got a lot of talent, but I don't know if a lot of these Georgian fighters fully rep Georgia because, like I said, they've got Ilia Topuria, but I feel like he represents Spain more than he represents Georgia, and because he represents kind of two countries at once and doesn't really fully represent Georgia, I can't count him as like a fully Georgian champion. So the standout fighter that I've chosen is Merab, and for all we know, in 2 weeks' time, Merab could be a champion of the world in the bantamweight division, and he is definitely the best bantamweight contender right now for Sean O'Malley. So I've got to include Merab. What he's done for Georgian MMA is crazy. And they've got some good contenders. They've got Roman Dolidze, who seems to be a pretty decent middleweight contender. They've got Giga Chikadze, another pretty decent featherweight contender. They've got Guram Gutadladze, who displayed at UFC Abu Dhabi, that he seems to be a good contender as well. So Georgia, even though they haven't had like that one staple champion yet, the amount of fighters that have come from Georgia have just ended up being killers. Like, it isn't like they've produced a bunch of soy fighters like Canada. The fighters that do succeed from Georgia tend to be absolute killers and tend to be some of the most successful contenders in the UFC. They've also got Arman Tsarukyan, but again, Arman Tsarukyan doesn't fully represent Georgia. He's Armenian as well, so I don't know if I can fully count Arman Tsarukyan as a Georgian fighter, but because of the amount of killers that have been raised in Georgia and the fact that it's such a small country as well with so many killers, I think we've got to give them respect, we've got to give them the credit, and we've got to put them this high on this list. So at number 7th on this list, because of the amount of killers they produce from such a small country, I'm going to go with Georgia. At number 6, I'm going to go with Mexico. Again, Mexican MMA has risen massively in the past couple of years, and there's currently 2 champions from Mexico with Brandon Moreno and Alexa Grasso, and the standout fighter I've chosen is Brandon Moreno. His story in the flyweight division, the amount of guys he's beaten in the flyweight division, had a great quadrilogy with Davison Figueiredo, and he's a former flyweight champion of the world. And we've got Alexa Grasso, who had a massive win over Valentina Shevchenko, the current flyweight champion of the world as well. So we've got to give Alexa Grasso and Brandon Moreno their props. We're also having a big event in Mexico in a couple of weeks' time at UFC Notch, headlined by 2 non-Mexicans, but still a big event in Mexico with a lot of Mexican prospects on there as well. And like I said, there's a lot of other big names as well. A former interim champion in Yair Rodriguez, still a top 5 featherweight to this day. They've got Irene Aldana, somebody who's challenged Amanda Nunes, one of the most interesting female fighters at the moment as well. There's a couple of contenders, and well, there's a couple of prospects as well. We've got Daniel Zeluba, they've got obviously Raul Rosas Jr., they've got Lupe Godinez, another ranked Mexican. So there seems to be just this massive surge in Mexican talent in the UFC in the past couple of years. They've had 2 champions, 1 current champion, 2 top contenders, a former interim champion as well in Yair Rodriguez, a lot of ranked fighters, and I can guarantee that list is only going to be added to after UFC Notch with the amount of Mexican talent on that list as well. So at number 6, I'm going to go with Mexico being the number 6 best country when it comes to the UFC. A lot of talent to come from Mexico. And when I say Mexico, I'm talking about purely Mexico, not Mexican American. I'm talking about purely Mexico. Now at number 5, I think this one's going to be quite controversial because of what I've done, but at number 5 I'm going to go with Australia/New Zealand. Now I know everyone gets pissed off when I categorise them both of the same country, but fuck it, man, I'm putting Australia and New Zealand at number 1. It's pretty much the same thing. Like, let's be completely honest, I'm not doing 2 separate country spaces for Australia and New Zealand. They are very similar with the fighters that they produce, so I'm going to combine them both, and because of that I'm going to include them at number 5. Now we're talking. Australia and New Zealand combined, they have produced so many killers. I mean, they've got 2 champions from the UFC. They've had Robert Whittaker, and obviously the standout fighter is Alexander Volkanovski. Volkanovski, some would say he's the greatest featherweight of all time. Definitely top 10 greatest fighters of all time in the UFC, full stop. One of the greatest of all time is Alexander Volkanovski. Paved the way for Australian MMA. And they've had Robert Whittaker, top 3 greatest middleweights of all time. Could potentially still win that belt again in the middleweight division because of the success he's been having recently. Top middleweight, and he always has been. But yeah, just the amount of talent to come from Australia and New Zealand is crazy. I mean, look at UFC 305. We've got guys like Steve Erceg and Kai Kara France facing each other, some of the top contenders in the flyweight division. We've got Dan Hooker, now a top 5 lightweight in the world. We've got Jack Della Maddalena, undefeated in the UFC, one of the best talents right now in the welterweight division, another top contender. Carlos Ulberg, big contender in the light heavyweight division as well. And they've guys like Tatu Ivaz, guys like Mark Hunt, who were other big names in Australia and New Zealand MMA. So Australia and New Zealand, they've produced so many top contenders, so many likeable fighters, and just the fighters that have come from Australia and New Zealand have done so well already. So I've got to include them at number 5. Like I said, UFC 305 just really displayed the talent that Australia have, and the fact that they've had one of the greatest of all time in Alexander Volkanovski from Australia and New Zealand definitely puts them at number 5 on this list, and Robert Whittaker as well, who who are still succeeding to this day. Whittaker's on a 2-fight winning streak, and if he wins his next fight against Chimaev, he's going to be fighting for a belt. So, yeah, Australia and New Zealand, they're going to go at number 5 on this list. And at number 4, I'm going to go with the UK. I'm going to go with the UK at number 4 on this list. The UK MMA scene was massive, as shown at UFC 304, and I think they're at number 4. Now, they've had 3 champions, and I know I said I'm not going to really be counted interim champions, but I think most people, and I know people are going to say this is British bias, but most people would say that Tom Aspinall is the real champion right now, not John Jones. He's the one disputing and defending the belt. So Tom Aspinall, I'm going to put him I'm going to count him as a British champion, but the standout fighter I've chosen is Michael Bisping. But yeah, Michael Bisping, Tom Aspinall right now. I'll talk about Tom Aspinall first. He is the best heavyweight in the world. I mean, he seems to be a heavyweight talent that we've never seen before. He's just demolishing heavyweights. Got wins over 5 current top 10 ranked heavyweights in the world. He would obliterate John Jones. He's the interim champion. He's the best heavyweight in the world. And I believe he's the only guy right now in the pound for pound rankings who has never won an undisputed belt. Obviously, Michael Bisping, first British champion. One of the biggest upsets in UFC when he beat Luke Rockhold. Got that big win over Anderson Silva as well. And he had a pretty good legacy as well, especially when he was fighting with one eye in an era where everybody was on steroids. You got to respect him for that. Leon Edwards as well had a really good welterweight run. Obviously no longer the champion, but got one of the best wins against Kamaru Usman, one of the most iconic knockouts as well. And just the amount of contenders and names that we've had from the UK in the UFC is crazy. I mean, despite having 3 champions, I mean, just look at the space right now. Paddy Pimblett, a ranked guy in the lightweight division, in the most difficult division where no one said he was ever going to become ranked. We've got MVP, a ranked welterweight, one of the best strikers in the UFC right now. Lerone Murphy, the dark horse of the featherweight division, who's another ranked fighter. Arnold Allen, a top 5 featherweight in the world right now. I think he's top 6, but still one of the best featherweights in the world right now. We've had guys like Paul Craig, who's had wins over Ankalaev and Jamal Hill. We've got Darren Till as well, who's fought for the belt before. So British MMA, definitely the best it's ever been after UFC 304, or maybe before UFC 304 when Leon was still the champion. But we've had 3 champions, we've had a shit ton of talent, we've got at least a couple of ranked British fighters in every single division. We also claimed Mohamed Makayev when he was in the flyweight division as a top 5 fighter before he got cut from the UFC. But yeah, British MMA, UK MMA, definitely the best it's ever been, and I've got to put them at number 4. 3 champions, shit ton of contenders, and shit ton of just names to come from the UK MMA. So I'm going to put UK MMA at number 4, and now we're in the big 3. At number 3, I'm going to go with Brazil. Now, Brazil, they just produce so many legends. They've had over 20 champions, which is fucking crazy. Having over 20 champions in the UFC to come from Brazil. And I feel like Brazil has always kind of dominated the UFC since its beginnings. The standout fighter that I've chosen is Anderson Silva, one of the greatest of all time, top 5 greatest of all time. He was playing the UFC on easy mode in his prime, and definitely one of the biggest things to come from Brazil. But even the other legends as well. Vitor Belfort, Lyoto Machida, Jose Aldo, one of the greatest of all time, arguably the greatest featherweight of all time. Amanda Nunes, the greatest female fighter of all time, retired holding 2 belts, also came from Brazil. The amount of talent that Brazil produces when it comes to athletes is insane. Now, I know a lot of them are kind of juice heads and everything, but still, the talent to come from Brazil is just insane. And even if you look at the current fighters, Alex Pereira, the light heavyweight champion of the world, accomplished more than anyone in such a small amount of time. Alejandro Pantoja, the current defending flyweight champion of the world as well. Brazil just seems to be doing really good. Like, you look at every single UFC division, there's at least like 5 different Brazilian contenders. I mean, even at the last UFC event, we had Caio Bralo, who got the win over Jared Cannonier. In the next UFC event, we've got Gilbert Burns, a Brazilian fighter, taking on Sean Brady. Brazilian have always had so many big names, so many big contenders, so much talent to come from Brazil. And in my opinion, they're definitely top 3 of the best countries to ever produce talent for the UFC. There's never ever going to be a time where there's not a shit ton of Brazilian talent in every single division in the UFC. They've produced so many legends, and it's not even like they've fallen off. There's still so many big Brazilian contenders today and champions today with Pereira and Pantoja. So Brazil, it's going to get the respect, and Brazil's got to make the top 3. Just having over 20 champions alone, and the fact that they've just been around since the start of the UFC, have to make this list. And number 2, I'm going to go with Russia. Now, Russia, they've only had 4 champions if you count Andrei Arlovski. If you count Arlovski, the champion, they've obviously had Arlovski, they've had Islam Makhachev, they've had PTN, and they've had Khabib Nurmagomedov. But yeah, Russian MMA in these past couple of years, not even just in the past couple of years, but just over time, has grown massively. The standout fighter that I've chosen from Russia is Islam Makhachev, but just look at the legends as well who's come from this place as well. I mean, like I said, Andrei Arlovsky, former legend in the heavyweight division, former heavyweight champion, Khabib Nurmagomedov, the casuals GOAT, one of the top 10 greatest of all time in my opinion. What Khabib achieved in the lightweight division is insane. Islam Makhachev, in my opinion, the greatest lightweight of all time, and he's literally the best fighter in the UFC right now, pound for pound #1, and that belt is going nowhere. Has double champ potential, at least did when Leon was the champion. So what Russia has accomplished is insane. And even if you just look away and look at the contenders right now in Russia as well, Peter Yan, former champion, top contender in the bantamweight division, Alexander Volkov on a 4-fight winning streak, Sergey Pavlovich, one of the most dangerous men in the UFC, and that's not even to mention the amount of Dagestani talent from Russia as well. I mean, Dagestani Russia can be a category of its own from the amount of Dagestani talent to come from the UFC. And because the Russian takeover seems to be going on in the UFC, you know, Russians are just kind of, you know, hate it or not, they seem to be taking over right now in the UFC with guys like Makhachev, Umar Nurmagomedov, Magomed Ankalaev, Movsar Evloev. Just the amount of contenders and fighters that have come from Russia in the UFC, and the amount of time that Russia has always been a top country in the UFC, you've got to give them the credit. So Russia is going to go at #2 as the best country when it comes to producing talent in the UFC, just because of what they've done recently. And at #1, it's got to be USA. I mean, UFC is an American company, but yeah, there's just too many champions to count. USA, it is kind of like the filler country for fighters. You've got fighters from, you know, Brazil, UK, Australia, whatever, and then the filler fighter is USA. It's kind of like the default country for fighters in the UFC. The standout fighter is John Jones. They hold 2 of the greatest of all time. They've got John Jones, who most would consider the greatest of all time, Demetrius Johnson, who some people would consider the greatest of all time. They've got DC, you know, a champion in 2 different weight classes, one of the greatest of all time as well. Stipe Miocic, former heavyweight champion, the greatest heavyweight of all time. Dominic Cruz, former bantamweight champion, the greatest bantamweight of all time. When it comes to producing high-level talent, the USA are just best at it, and it just seems like I said, most fighters come from America. That's the thing about the USA. So many fighters from the roster come from USA to the point where it's too hard to count how many champions have come from the USA. They do dominate the UFC, I will say though, recently, in the past couple of years, UFC seems to be becoming a lot more international. I mean, we've only got, I believe, 1 American champion right now in Sean O'Malley, but just because of the amount of top contenders and champions that have come from America to the point where it's too hard to count, I've got to put the USA at #1 on this list. But that is me ranking every single country in the UFC based on the talent that they've produced. Let me know if I should have included any other countries or if you would have changed the rankings around, but that is my list. Thank you for watching.